It started with the sound of paper. Not the kind you crumple up and throw away. This was the soft, unmistakable whisper of envelopes being slid out of a metal mailbox at dawn. I wasn't supposed to hear it. The morning was still half asleep, the sky bruised purple with the last shadows of night, and the neighborhood sat in its usual false peace. But that sound, it cut straight through the stillness. I peered through my front window, just enough so my breath wouldn't fog the glass, and saw her. Karen. Karen Dawson, 53, HOA board treasurer, the kind of woman who spoke in rules instead of sentences. Her short blonde hair was cut sharp enough to slice bread, and she wore that same light blue windbreaker she always did when patrolling the neighborhood, like she was our self-appointed sheriff. Only this time, she wasn't strolling or measuring someone's lawn with her tape measure. She was at my mailbox, with her hand inside. My heart stuttered. At first, I told myself maybe she was just looking. Maybe she'd found a letter on the ground. But then she pulled out a neat stack of envelopes, my envelopes, glanced around, and slid them into her own canvas tote bag. Calm as you like. The world didn't tilt or slow like in movies. It snapped into crystal focus. The HOA might have been petty about fence heights and mailbox paint colors before, but this was federal. And yet, even as anger flared hot in my chest, something colder slipped in alongside it. Questions. Why was she taking my mail? How long had this been happening? And most importantly, how far was she willing to go? I could have run outside right then. Could have shouted her name, taken my phone out, gotten the whole thing on video. But my gut told me something. This wasn't about one morning. If I reacted too soon, I'd scare her off before I knew the full truth. I stepped back from the window, heart pounding, and in that still, electric moment, I realized this wasn't just a nosy neighbor. This was a woman at war. Welcome to Fenceline Story. Mention where you're watching this video from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Because trust me, you're not going to want to miss how this one unfolds. See, the thing about Karen was that she never acted without a reason. Twisted, self-serving reasons maybe, but reasons all the same. She ran the HOA like a personal kingdom. You didn't just break a rule in Oak Ridge Estates, you committed a sin. She kept binders on all of us. Notes about who painted their shutters the wrong shade of white, who left their trash bins out too long, who parked overnight on the street. If she was in my mailbox, it meant I was on her list. But why now? The week before, I'd gotten into a heated argument with her during the HOA monthly meeting. She tried to push a new rule banning non-standard holiday decorations after one neighbor put up a Diwali display. I'd called her out in front of everyone, accused her of discrimination, and refused to back down even when her voice got that high-pitched, brittle edge it always did before she exploded. She'd smiled at me after, but it wasn't a smile. It was a warning. I thought it would end there. It hadn't. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake it. Every time I walked past my front door, I saw her hand in my mailbox. Every time I passed the kitchen counter, I imagined my bills, my letters, maybe even my bank statements sitting in her tote bag, being read, copied, used for something. By the time night fell, I was pacing my living room. My wife, Emily, 35, calm where I was restless, told me I was overthinking. But the way she said it told me she didn't fully believe it either. That's when the great question landed. The one that would gnaw at me for weeks. The one that would pull me into a fight I never planned to have. If someone in power can break the rules they claim to enforce, what's to stop them from doing worse? Because if Karen could reach into my mailbox and take what wasn't hers, she could reach into anything. My privacy, my livelihood, even my safety. And if I let her get away with it, what did that make me? I didn't know it yet, but I had just stepped onto a battlefield. And in this war, there would be no neutral ground. The morning after I caught Karen stealing my mail, I stood at my front porch with a cup of coffee and tried to see the neighborhood the way she saw it. Oak Ridge Estates looked perfect on the surface. Wide, freshly paved streets lined with neat rows of identical mailboxes. Lawns trimmed like golf courses. No peeling paint, no mismatched fences. It was the kind of place the HOA brochures boasted about, the kind of community real estate agents called desirable with a knowing smile. But I'd lived there long enough to know the truth. Oak Ridge was perfect because someone was always watching, and Karen was their queen. When she wasn't patrolling on foot, she sat on her porch with a pair of binoculars. I wasn't exaggerating, binoculars. She'd pretend to birdwatch, but everyone knew she was logging who came and went, what cars stayed too long, whose grass had gone half an inch too high. Still, this was the first time her obsession had turned criminal. And that's what kept nagging at me. Why escalate? Why take such a risk? I decided to start digging. First stop. My neighbor, Mark Rivera, 41, ex-military, now working security for a logistics company. He'd been here longer than me and had a knack for knowing things without ever being seen knowing them. I caught him on his driveway, tightening a strap on the back of his motorcycle. "You ever notice Karen messing with mailboxes?" I asked casually. He gave me a long look, the kind that said, "Careful what you're stepping into." "Not mine," he said. "But I've heard things. Check with the Hendersons, 2 streets over. They've had some missing packages." When I pressed him for more, he shook his head. "I keep my head down, man. That's how you survive here." It was the first time I'd heard someone talk about surviving in Oak Ridge. And it hit me. This wasn't just about my mail. This was a pattern. That night, I walked the 2 streets over to the Hendersons' place. Tom and Marie Henderson were in their late 60s, retired teachers, the kind of people who still waved at every car that passed. Marie answered the door, her warm smile fading when I brought up Karen. "She took your mail?" she whispered, as if the hedges might be listening. "Oh dear." Marie told me they'd lost several packages over the last 6 months. Medication deliveries, birthday gifts from their grandkids. They'd reported it to the HOA, but guess who handled the complaint? Karen herself. She said she'd look into it, Marie said, her voice shaking, but nothing ever came of it. And we didn't want to make trouble. You know how she is. I knew. And that's when it all clicked. Karen wasn't just nosy. She was using her position to control information. Mail held power. Bills, personal letters, bank notices, even HOA violation warnings. They all passed through those little metal boxes. If she had access, she could learn anything she wanted about you, even things she could use against you. But it went deeper than that. Over the next week, I quietly asked around. Some neighbors shut their doors. Others talked in low voices, glancing around like we were in some Cold War spy movie. A picture began to form. Karen had enemies. People who challenged her rules found themselves hit with sudden fines, anonymous complaints, or mysteriously lost paperwork that kept them from appealing decisions. And almost always, the first sign of trouble was missing or delayed mail. It wasn't about stealing for money, it was about control. About reminding people who really ran Oak Ridge Estates. The part that chilled me most? No one was stopping her. The HOA board wasn't just afraid of her, they depended on her. She managed the books, tracked violations, and handled correspondence with the city. And with that much responsibility, no one wanted to accuse her of wrongdoing without proof. The police? They weren't interested in a mailbox misunderstanding, unless I could prove theft beyond a doubt. And the Postal Service? They'd investigate if a pattern emerged, but they needed evidence. I realized I was standing in the middle of a chess game I hadn't agreed to play, one where she already knew all my moves before I made them. It was Emily who broke my spiral one night over dinner. "You keep saying she's dangerous," she said, setting down her fork. "But dangerous people always leave cracks. Find hers." The idea stuck. Karen was meticulous, but if she was taking my mail, she had to store it somewhere before doing whatever she did with it. If I could catch her with more than just my letters, if I could connect her to missing mail across the neighborhood, then I'd have the pattern the postal inspector needed. But it wouldn't be easy. Karen didn't just operate in daylight. She had her routes, her routines, her little rituals. I'd have to be patient, careful, and absolutely certain before I moved. Because in Oak Ridge Estates, you didn't just accuse the queen without proof. You either won or you were finished. And that's when I decided, quietly, without telling anyone, that I wasn't just going to watch from the window anymore. If Karen wanted a war, I'd give her one. Started small. A cold shoulder at the mailbox from neighbors who used to chat with me. Sidewalk conversations that stopped the moment I walked by. Even the Hendersons, who had whispered their fears to me just a week earlier, avoided eye contact when I waved. It didn't take long to realize why. Karen was working her poison. One Tuesday evening, I overheard her on the sidewalk with my next-door neighbor, Lydia Morris, 45, who never missed a piece of gossip. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught enough. Financial trouble, late bills, suspicious activity with his property taxes. She was talking about me, and she was using my stolen mail to make it sound real. By the next HOA meeting, the damage was visible. People shifted in their chairs when I walked in, whispering into their hands. Karen sat at the head of the table, her windbreaker neatly folded beside her binder, a smug tilt to her lips. She didn't need to confront me outright. The seed was already planted. The tension spread like a slow leak. Mark Rivera, who had given me my first lead, told me he didn't want to get involved anymore. He said it with an apologetic shrug, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. Helping me wasn't worth being her next target. The Hendersons kept their curtains drawn. Marie still waved when she thought no one was looking, but Tom didn't even nod anymore. Even Emily started feeling it. She'd bump into neighbors at the grocery store and get clipped. Polite hellos instead of friendly conversation. One afternoon, she came home in tears after overhearing someone at the park say, "It's a shame about them. You never really know people." But the worst was the meeting 2 weeks later. Karen stood up mid-discussion, pretending to shuffle papers, and accidentally read aloud an overdue notice from my electric bill. She acted surprised. "Oh, this must have gotten mixed in with the HOA paperwork." A few people gasped. One man coughed into his hand to hide a laugh. My face burned hot, but I didn't say a word. If I lashed out, I'd look unstable. That's what she wanted. The ripple effects weren't just social, they were strategic. Small citations began appearing in my mailbox. A warning about excessive noise when I used my lawnmower on a Saturday. A violation for improperly stored trash cans, even though they'd been at the curb for less than 12 hours. A $50 fine for overgrown weeds in a flower bed Emily had replanted the day before. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. Each letter came on HOA letterhead, signed by Karen, and each one chipped away at my standing in the community. I wasn't the only one feeling it. A week later, I got a late-night knock on my door. It was Chris Weller, 39, a father of 2 who lived 3 houses down. His face was pale, his voice low. "She's got my wife's medical bills," he said. "How else would she know about her surgery? She's been spreading it around like it's some dirty secret." Chris told me he'd seen Karen at his mailbox one morning when he left for work early. She hadn't noticed him, and when he confronted her later, she'd laughed it off, said she was helping collect because raccoons had been spotted in the area. But Chris had been here long enough to know better. "She's not just nosy, man. She's dangerous." Dangerous was the right word. I'd seen HOA disputes get ugly before, over paint colors, parked RVs, or lawn ornaments. But this wasn't about a rulebook anymore. This was about personal destruction. Karen was weaponizing the very structure of the HOA, bending it to her own will, and using stolen information to back her attacks. And the more people she isolated, the more power she gained. Those who stayed silent were left alone. Those who spoke up were picked off, one by one. Then came the moment that made it personal in a way I couldn't forgive. One afternoon, Emily found an envelope wedged into our storm door. Inside was a photocopy of a letter I'd sent to my brother. Nothing sensitive, just personal family matters. But across the top, written in neat, looping cursive, were the words, "Watch who you trust." Emily's hands shook as she showed it to me. She didn't need to say the name. We both knew who it was from. That was when fear turned into something sharper. Not just for me, but for the people who didn't even realize they were being watched, targeted, and controlled. But here's the cruel thing about a neighborhood like Oak Ridge. Even when you see the trap, you can't just leave. Moving meant losing equity, uprooting our lives, and letting her win without a fight. So I started thinking differently. If she wanted to play in the shadows, I'd drag this fight into the light. But I couldn't do it alone, not yet. I began watching her as closely as she watched us, tracking her patrol times, noting which streets she lingered on, which houses she approached. I kept my phone ready, camera app open, every time I saw her. The more I observed, the more I realized she wasn't careful because she didn't have to be. No one had ever made her fear consequences. But that was going to change. By then, the neighborhood felt like a chessboard, the air thick with suspicion. Friendships were breaking under the strain, and block parties and barbecues were quietly canceled. Everyone smiled less. Doors stayed locked. Conversations stayed indoors. Karen had turned Oak Ridge into a place where trust was currency, and she was the only one printing the money. And I was done letting her run the mint. The night after Emily found that envelope, I sat at our kitchen table with a notepad, a cup of black coffee, and a single thought burning in my head. If Karen could make the rules work for her, then so could I. The problem was I couldn't just accuse her. In Oak Ridge, accusations without proof didn't stick. They backfired. She'd turn it into a story about harassment, about a neighbor obsessed with ruining her. I needed more than suspicion. I needed a pattern, a paper trail, and if possible, witnesses. I started with observation. Every morning, I positioned myself behind my living room curtains with my phone camera rolling. The footage piled up. Karen stopping in front of houses she didn't live in, glancing around, fiddling with mailboxes. First, it wasn't much. But after a week, I had over a dozen clips showing her in places she had no reason to be. But I needed a direct link to stolen mail. That's when I thought of Mark Rivera. I caught him one Saturday morning while he was working on his motorcycle. "I know you said you didn't want to get involved," I said, "but I'm putting together a record, not just for me, for anyone she's targeted. If we don't do something now, she'll keep going." He hesitated, tightening a bolt, before finally nodding. "I can't be the guy on camera, but I've got a trail cam, night vision, motion sensor. You can borrow it." That camera became my best weapon. I mounted it on the trunk of the oak tree in my front yard, angled perfectly toward my mailbox. The first 2 nights were quiet, but on the third, just before dawn, it triggered. Karen, in her windbreaker, tote bag over her shoulder, opening my mailbox like it belonged to her. The footage was crystal clear. Still, I wasn't ready to strike. I wanted more. I started visiting the Hendersons and Chris Weller again, this time asking if they'd be willing to quietly check their mail for signs of tampering and report to me. Chris agreed instantly. Karen had gone too far with his wife's medical bills. The Hendersons were nervous, but Marie eventually said yes. Within days, Chris texted me a picture of his own tampered mailbox. The latch had fresh scratches, like someone had forced it open. The Hendersons found one of their bank statements missing from an envelope that had been slit open and resealed. Piece by piece, the evidence was stacking up. Then I found my leverage. One Saturday morning, I saw Karen slip a thick envelope into her tote outside the Miller's house. I knew the Millers. They were quiet, private people, but they worked in finance. The next day, I called Daniel Miller under the pretense of asking about lawn service and casually mentioned I'd seen Karen near his mailbox. Silence. Then a sharp, "That explains it." Daniel told me they'd been waiting on important business documents. Documents that had never arrived. And more importantly, he wasn't afraid to go on record. That was the crack Emily had been talking about. By now, I had enough to make a move, but I wanted it to be public. Quietly calling the postal inspector would stop her. Sure, but it would also keep the neighborhood in the dark, and Karen would just spin it as a misunderstanding. I wanted everyone to see her for what she really was. The next HOA meeting was my stage. I showed up early, sitting directly across from her at the long folding table. She gave me that fake smile greeting she always did, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. Halfway through the meeting, when she started rattling off the list of new compliance violations, I raised my hand. "I'd like to discuss an ongoing security issue," I said. Karen frowned but gestured for me to continue. I stood, pulled my phone from my pocket, and cast the video from Mark's trail cam onto the projector the HOA used for budget charts. The room fell silent. There she was, in high definition, opening my mailbox. Then another clip, Chris Weller's box. then the Hendersons, then the Millers. For different homes, for different times, all caught on camera. Karen's face didn't move at first. She just sat there, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the screen. But when whispers started to ripple through the room, she broke. "That's not what it looks like," she snapped. "I was checking for vandalism." While removing mail, Daniel Miller's voice cut through the noise. He stood up, arms crossed. "Because that's a federal crime, Karen." The murmurs turned into outright chatter. People I'd barely spoken to before were pulling out their phones, taking pictures, texting the footage to others. And that's when I dropped the last piece. "I've already sent all of this to the postal inspector," I said. "They'll be here by the end of the week." For the first time since I'd moved to Oak Ridge, Karen didn't have a comeback. She just sat there, her cheeks red, her hands gripping the edge of the table. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Because as satisfying as it was to see her cornered in public, I knew she wasn't the type to go down without a fight. The real battle was still ahead, when federal law enforcement stepped in, and the entire neighborhood had to decide whose side they were on. And I was ready for it. 3 days after the HOA meeting, a white sedan with federal plates rolled quietly into Oak Ridge Estates. No sirens, no flashing lights, just 2 plainclothes postal inspectors in dark jackets stepping out, briefcases in hand. Word travels fast in a neighborhood like ours, and by the time they knocked on Karen's door, at least half a dozen curtains were twitching. I was one of them. She opened the door with that same tight smile she used when confronting rule breakers. But this time it didn't hold. The inspectors showed their badges, and whatever she saw in their eyes made her step back without a word. For the next 40 minutes, they were inside. I didn't know exactly what was being said, but I could imagine questions about the footage, about the complaints from multiple residents, about the pattern of missing and tampered mail. When they emerged, Karen followed, pale and stiff. One of the inspectors carried a large evidence box. The other was reading her rights. The street went silent. Even the breeze seemed to stop. They walked her to the car without handcuffs. Maybe a courtesy. Maybe because she wasn't resisting, but the sight was enough. The woman who had controlled every inch of this place for years was being driven away in the back of a government vehicle. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. That night, the neighborhood was electric. People I'd never spoken to before knocked on my door to thank me. Chris Weller brought over a case of beer. The Hendersons hugged me. Daniel Miller shook my hand and said, "You did the one thing nobody else could. You made her afraid." But not everyone was grateful. Lydia Morris cornered me at the curb the next morning. Her voice low but sharp. "You've made a mess of things," she said. "Karen kept this place in order. Now who's going to stop people from breaking the rules?" It hit me then. Some people didn't just tolerate her. They needed her. They liked the control, the predictability, even if it came at the cost of everyone else's privacy. A week later, a formal notice came from the HOA board. Karen had been removed from her position pending legal proceedings. The postal inspector's office was pressing charges for mail theft, a federal felony. If convicted, she could face prison time. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge Estates was without its queen. But the victory wasn't clean. Without her, the HOA floundered. Meetings stretched for hours as board members argued over everything from landscaping budgets to mailbox paint codes. Petty disputes that Karen would have crushed in minutes now dragged on endlessly. The neighborhood looked freer, but also messier. Lawns got a little wilder. Holiday decorations stayed up too long. The air of perfect order cracked. And I realized something. Karen's reign had been a prison, but it had also been a structure. Taking her down had freed us, but it had also forced us to face the uncomfortable truth. Without someone in charge, even a tyrant, a community has to figure out what it wants to be. One evening, Emily and I walked past Karen's old house. The blinds were shut, the yard untended. It felt strange, almost haunted. "Do you think she'll come back?" Emily asked. I thought about it. Karen wasn't the type to disappear quietly, but prison, if it came to that, would change her. And if she did come back, she wouldn't have the same grip. People had seen too much. "I don't know," I said finally. "But if she does, it won't be the same war. Everyone's awake now." That night, I sat on my porch with a beer, listening to the crickets. The neighborhood was quieter than it had been in months. Not the tense, brittle quiet of Karen's surveillance, but the easy quiet of people minding their own business. I thought about the first morning I'd seen her hand in my mailbox. How small the act seemed compared to everything that followed. And I realized the real question wasn't why she did it. It was why nobody stopped her sooner. Fear, comfort, a little of both. The final lesson was a hard one. In places like Oak Ridge, power doesn't just corrupt, it hides in plain sight. And the moment you stop paying attention, someone will pick it up and use it. I'd fought back because she made it personal, but I'd won because I made it public. That's the only way to beat someone who thrives in the shadows. Drag them into the light and let everyone see. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, I raised my bottle to the street. Not in celebration, not exactly, but in acknowledgement. Because this was still home. And no matter who sat in the HOA's big chair next, I wasn't going back to watching from behind the curtains. Not ever again. If you were in my place, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have taken the fight to the queen?